Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's conversation with a dear friend and distinguished diplomat and academic, Dr. John Limbert. John, presume on the old friendship and call Dr. Limbert by his first name, uh, has the unique distinction of being one of the survivors of the 444 days of hostage taking in Tehran beginning in 1979. He is here today to discuss with a young person who can't possibly remember 1979, Negar Murtazavi. Iran since 1979, today, 4 decades later, and where it has gone and may be going into the future. So thank you. Take it, Negar.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for holding this important and timely event today. I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for giving us your time today. And I also want to remind you just at the top that for the Q&A session at the end of the discussion, there is a chat box underneath your Zoom window and there's a Q&A box. Make sure if you have questions for Ambassador Limbert that you type them into the Q&A section and not into the chat section. So Ambassador John Limbert, as mentioned, is a retired U.S. diplomat and a retired professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy. During a 34-year diplomatic career, he served mostly in the Middle East and Islamic Africa, was ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, and a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for Iranian affairs. In 1964, he started working in Iran as a teacher and later joined the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and then served as one of the last American diplomats in Iran, where he was then held hostage after the 1979 revolution. Ambassador John Limbert, welcome.
Thank you very much, Negar, and greetings to everyone. I saw a very impressive guest list, and I would love to be able to greet everybody individually, but I think it would take us more than the whole hour we have.
Okay, so let's move into the question and answer. Let's talk about the prospects for diplomacy under this administration. The Trump administration, it's been 2 years since Donald Trump pulled out of the Iran deal, or the JCPOA, and started a campaign of maximum pressure against Iran. President Trump has said that he wants to cut a better new deal with Iran because the former one, or the current one, is a terrible deal, as he says. In your view, Ambassador Limbert, do you think Tehran will negotiate with Donald Trump under any circumstances in the remaining of his term or in a future presidency if he wins the elections again?
Well, it's hard, you learn in our profession, you never say never. But considering that there are only about 200 days left in his term, and if he's not reelected, if there's a new president, it's hard to see what could be accomplished, even if the two sides could get together. But the problem is that President Trump has rejected the approach that President Obama had made during his term, which was to attempt to reestablish a different way of doing things. In other words, simply talking to each other instead of yelling at each other. And that, of course, it's interesting. For the Iranian side, it seems to me that that's not difficult for them. They're used to that. They're used to that kind of relationship with the United States. What threw them off their stride, I think, was President Obama's approach. The problem for President Trump, of course, is that he is absolutely obsessed with his predecessor. And we've certainly seen that in the last few days. But we've seen it essentially for 4 years. That anything that has Obama's name on it, whether it's a health insurance scheme or an international agreement, has got by definition he's going to reject. And if he were to negotiate another version of the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, it doesn't really matter to him whether it's better or worse. If it's his, he'll call it better and declare a victory.
So what do you think is the goal of, first of all, President Trump himself and then the Trump administration, because we know his advisors, people close to him like Mike Pompeo right now, and beforehand, for example, the Secretary of State Tillerson, who was opposed to pulling out of the nuclear deal and was fired by President Trump, now he has surrounded himself with people like Mike Pompeo. What do you think is the goal of the administration? If there is one single goal, what is that? And for the president himself?
It's really hard. It's really hard to say, Nagar, what their goal is. Just looking at them from the outside, they're all over. They seem to be all over the place. There seem to be some people who say, well, we want to get another agreement with Iran. We want Iran to stop doing this or start doing that. Others who say we want Iran to we want to bring so much pressure on Iran that it surrenders and does everything we want. And then at the far end, there are people in and around this administration who are looking for the complete collapse of the Islamic Republic. And, I'm no fan of the Islamic Republic, but some of the ideas they have for replacing it, I find pretty scary.
So this maximum pressure campaign that President Trump has basically replaced the nuclear deal with sanctions and the rhetoric and increased tension. Do you see any success or any path to success for that with this maximum pressure to basically coerce Iran or force Iran into the negotiating table for whatever that new and better deal is going to be?
Well, it hasn't done so far. If that's their goal, and I'm not sure it is, it hasn't done it so far. It hasn't done it so far. I mean, for 40 years, we've tried just about every known sanction, every known form of pressure against the Islamic Republic, and it hasn't worked very well. I mean, I think almost anyone would admit that. Would admit that. The other problem is, as I mentioned, if you don't have a goal, then you can always claim success because you have no criteria to measure what you're doing. I mean, you could say, yes, this was successful, but then you say successful in doing what? Well, no, it was just success. It was just successful. I love to quote Lewis Carroll, who says, if you don't know where you're going, then absolutely any road will get you there.
I see. And what about Iran's internal dynamics? How has this maximum pressure, the sanctions, how do you think that has affected Iran's internal dynamics? We know of the moderates, of the hardliners in Iran. There are these competing factions. There were the moderates who negotiated with the Obama administration under President Rouhani. They cut this historic deal, and now it seems that the hardliners are trying to consolidate power and weaken the moderates. How do you see the maximum pressure playing out internally in Iran?
Well, I mean, it's clearly not helping anyone who sees a different kind of relationship in Iran, who would prefer a different kind of relationship with the United States. I mean, one of less hostility and more engagement. But on the other hand, the internal dynamics in Iran are for Iranians. And I think we delude ourselves if we think that if we go into this gear, or if we ratchet up this, or we ratchet down that, we're going to affect the internal dynamics of the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic, like every other place, has its own politics, its own factions, its own direction. It seems to me the height of arrogance to think, well, if we do this, this faction will benefit. If we do that, that faction will benefit. It's a combination, I suppose, of arrogance and ignorance, which, of course, we've seen in large measure in the seats, frankly, of both sides for a long time.
I wanted to ask you this question later, but I think now is a good time to mention this. We've heard for about 40 years, almost since the beginning after the revolution, that the this regime is about to collapse. It's in final days during the war, afterwards under sanctions, and all of this back and forth between Tehran and Washington over the years. How do you see that argument? You see basically any scenario and some people compare, especially right now these days, to immediately before the Iranian Revolution. You were there, you were watching it up close. Do you see any resemblance between those days and now? Do you see a scenario for an immediate regime change? And do you see any viable opposition for, in case there's regime change and after this regime comes into power? There are the Mujahideen Khalq, who've been very active for 4 decades. There's the former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who's in this area, in the Washington area, and some others, opposition figures who have been mentioned.
Those are really good questions. I can remember when I was in Iran in the summer of 1979, the question going around in Persian was "Ina ke miran," meaning when are they leaving, when are they going, as though it was sort of next week or by the end of the month at the latest. And they've been in power, for better or worse, for 40 years. I mean, again, despite sanctions, despite a terrible war, despite economic hardship, economic mismanagement, incredibly inept diplomacy, international isolation, they're still there. The Islamic Republic is still there. It's not a model of ideal government. At least to me, it isn't. By any or to many of us, I think many of us would prefer to see something else. But it's defied a lot of predictions that it was going to fall imminently. I mean, it can't last forever. Nothing lasts forever. But I think what I don't see an imminent collapse, barring some really unforeseen circumstance. I mean, the monarchy fell at a time when it had it in some ways was much stronger than it had been in earlier periods. Yet it could not survive the shocks of 1978, 79. Regime change. The phrase regime change to me is a loaded one, because if you bring a new system in, what do you get? You mentioned the MEK. You mentioned the MEK. The MEK has friends in and around this administration. Remember, you mentioned people like John Bolton and Rudy Giuliani and Elaine Chao and others. Although they've also have friends in liberal circles, whom we all know. This is a pretty scary group. And at least talking to many Iranian friends, they want no part of this. They want no part of this group. Not that they like what they have now necessarily. But what they're looking at is something much worse. One analyst described the MEK, for example, as sort of a combination of Jonestown, this suicide cult of the late 1970s, and maybe the Khmer Rouge, the murder cult in Cambodia of the 70s. So if you like those, maybe the MEK is just the thing you need.
And what about the return of some form of monarchy of the Pahlavi family? That's possible. But again, my only caution on this is a matter for Iranians to decide. That it's not a matter for foreigners to decide. Certainly not a matter for Americans to decide. I mean, our experience of meddling in
internal politics in Iran, or in most places, is not a happy one. And the results have not been fortunate. The results have not been fortunate. And I think getting involved in that again, thinking that we can influence events in a way either to our advantage or to the advantage of many Iranians, I think is a delusion.
So coming back here in Washington and with the Trump administration who's in power now, we talked about their goals and the potential, even if there exists a strategy. Do you think President Trump wants a war with Iran? Does the Trump administration, people around him like Mike Pompeo or anyone else, do they want to start some form of a military tension with Iran? We've seen the incidents happening in the Persian Gulf and in Iraq with the killing of the Iranian commander, Qasem Soleimani, and all of that. It seems like the two sides have been inching closer to some form of a military conflict. Do you think that's the goal of President Trump and parts of the administration?
I can't speak. I can't speak, Nagar, for the president or others. But he certainly was elected on this idea of no more military fiascos in the Middle East, no more stupid wars in the Middle East. And I was part of our misadventure in Iraq. I served there twice. So I've seen up close and personal just what missteps can lead to that kind of a disaster. And so far he has certainly stopped short of an open conflict. Maybe for reasons of American politics, reasons of being elected. But if that's his reason, that's good, and I'll give him credit for that. I would give him credit for that. What I worry about is the two sides stumbling into war on the basis of misunderstanding, a misunderstanding in the Persian Gulf, an encounter between naval forces there, for example, that gets escalated. And the problem now is that the very preliminary steps, those first steps that we took under the previous administration toward establishing channels of communication so that some incident did not escalate, those are gone. We really don't have anything. I mean, Secretary Kerry could call up Foreign Minister Zarif if he needed to. Others at a lower level communicated with their Iranian counterparts or American counterparts. As far as I know, those channels are gone. And so, if there is a misunderstanding, if one of those fast boats in the Gulf, fast boats in the Revolutionary Guard Navy, driven, I think, by some unemployed Tehran taxi driver, makes a miscalculation or turns left instead of right, turns left instead of right, the possibility of escalation, the possibility of conflict is there, and I don't see any. It's very difficult to see any way of backing out of it.
For those who haven't lived in Tehran, like me and you, Tehran taxi drivers are known for their exceptional driving skills. You have to go and see for yourself. So
it is indescribable, really.
Right. Do you, and this is a question I get from a lot of people, do you see the rivalry in the region or this proxy war or the increasing tension going beyond the region? Some ask about Latin America because Iran and the US both have interests there, or in other areas of the region who haven't been impacted by the proxy fights.
No, I don't. I don't really. I know that there are voices that have greatly inflated what Iran is, what it's capable of doing. There is something You can't listen or read anything, Nagar, these days without reading about the so-called Iranian threat. Well, my question is always, threat to whom? And what is this threat? And how does it threaten? I mean, if the Islamic Republic threatens anybody, it threatens itself and its own people, I think, more than anyone else.
And moving back to the JCPOA, the almost on life support Iran deal that the Trump administration or President Trump pulled out of 2 years ago. And now it seems like the administration is trying to make this argument that somehow they are still a participant of an agreement that they exited, and then use that argument in the UN for possible snapback sanctions on Iran, or to extend the UN arms embargo on Iran that's going to expire soon this fall. Do you think this argument will have much backing at the UN Security Council? Will Europe, for example, come to Washington's side? Will Russia and China stand up to it? How do you think this is going to play out?
As far as I can tell, I haven't followed the details of this, but as far as I can tell, no, it's not going. This is because it's a pretty transparent attempt to have both God and the date. That is, to have your cake and eat it too. To have your cake and eat it too. You're not in the JCPOA, but you are in the JCPOA. I mean, listen, either you are or you aren't. Having worked in the State Department for a long time, though, I can imagine some of the meetings there that are going on, and basically the subject is, okay, what else can we do to annoy the Islamic Republic? And here's something. Here's something that someone came up with. Whether it has any basis in reality is another question.
And speaking of the administration's basically new approach to diplomacy, I also wanted to add, because you mentioned this Persian phrase, that for those who don't know, Ambassador Lindbergh also is fluent in Persian, to the point that he knows all the phrases and expressions and poems, and that's very impressive. So speaking again about Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, who is a central figure in the Trump administration's maximum policy on Iran, in some ways, sometimes his rhetoric is even more hawkish than the president himself. We know President Trump keeps saying he wants to negotiate with the Iranian leaders. Sometimes he says that they are lovely men, they're amazing leaders, and we can get along. But Secretary Pompeo has been consistently, the rhetoric has been very hawkish. He's had these 12 conditions or demands from Iran, and these famous demands that some equate basically to regime change or the end of the Islamic Republic if all those 12 conditions were met. Do you think he is in line with the president, or does he want something more? Is he planning something more? Is there a strategy for something beyond what the president is saying? And basically, is he pushing for some form of a military conflict that the president doesn't want, or regime change in Iran?
It's a good question. I don't know. He's obviously very much in line with the president's thinking. The two of them seem to work well together. He claims, of course, that he is not looking for regime change, but he also claims that he has great sympathy for the aspirations of the Iranian people. Frankly, that's very hard. That's very hard to believe, based on his actions. I mean, he seems to be saying, okay, Iranians, rise up, somehow shed your blood, martyr yourself, get rid of this regime, and then we'll bring our friends the MEK into power. And if you think you have it bad now, just wait until these gentlemen and ladies show up.
And ladies, exactly. So speaking of the aspirations of Iranian people, and also I want to talk about how sanctions are harming ordinary Iranians, or basically the main ones, middle classes, working classes, Iranians. are the ones who are taking the main pressure of sanctions. And then now under coronavirus, COVID-19, we've seen so many calls to the administration from the UN Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, even Democratic presidential nominees, and then now Joe Biden and some of the senators and Democratic Congress members. But we don't see much movement in the administration as far as easing the restrictions on Iran. And there's precedents for that. For example, President Bush eased sanctions in 2003 after the earthquake. President Obama did under an earthquake. What do you think the Trump administration can do or should do? And what is so far their action? How does this speak of the, as you're saying, the claim that they care for the aspirations of the Iranian people?
Nigor, it's a pretty thin claim. It's hard to believe. I mean, you mentioned sanctions, but I would also mention the travel ban. I would also mention the travel ban, as though someone's grandparent, someone's grandmother represents a security threat to the United States. I don't see the point of these things. And at one point to claim how much we love the Iranian people and how much we share their aspirations for a better life, and then on the other hand, do everything we can to ruin the economy. It's pretty transparent to me. I mean, this is really beyond crocodile tears. I mean, probably the crocodile isn't even shedding tears in this case.
I see. And let's talk about a future president in case President Trump doesn't win a second term, and we see a Democratic president, President Joe Biden. Do you think he will return back to the JCPOA? Will he try to amend it? Will he try to renegotiate some terms, considering that some of the dates, the sunset in the JCPOA are getting close? And what do you think is going to happen under President Biden? What do you think should be the best course of action? Should he try to amend? Should he just immediately rejoin the JCPOA? What do you think?
A lot depends on what happens on the Iranian side. Because one of the problems that's bedeviled our relationship for the last 40 years is timing. When one side is ready, the other is not. I mean, I was in the Obama administration in its first term, early in its first term, and our attempts to not to be friends with the Islamic Republic, but to change the kind of relationship, find some kind of more productive relationship. We're frankly going nowhere because the Iranians were used to. They were used to being denounced and being bashed, and they denounced back, and they threatened back, and they insulted back. And now you had something very different going on. And it caught the Iranians off guard. They were wrong-footed. They did not. It took them about 4 years before they responded. The other problem, of course, in those days was you had a president, an Iranian president, President Ahmadinejad, who was in Washington, was toxic. Didn't matter. Nobody was listening to it. Didn't matter what he said. He weighed sense or nonsense. It didn't matter. And things didn't really begin to open up until, there were a number of things that happened, but one of them was the change of administration in Iran. Now we have a new president we might have a new president in Washington in January 2021, but Iran has an election that same year, 2021. When is it scheduled for? March?
2021, yeah.
2021. In March, it's scheduled for March, I think.
I believe so, yeah.
But so in a sense, then what's going to happen? What kind of administration you got? What kind of administration are you going to have? I mean, in the first Obama administration, for example, on the nuclear the nuclear negotiations, we were chasing the Iranian nuclear negotiator simply refused to meet with his American counterpart. He met once in 2009, and for the next 4 years, spent the next 4 years running away from him or her to avoid a meeting. And it wasn't until you had a new negotiator, the foreign minister, things changed completely. Things changed completely. So you have a new cast of a new cast of characters. And this has been one of those things that's as I said, bedeviled the relationship for a long time. Very often, it's just a matter of bad timing. When one side is ready, the other is not. And also, you have this reservoir, this enormous reservoir of mistrust, where each side assumes that the other is up to something. And so, as soon as one side says, "Oh, we're ready to talk about this or that," the other side says, well, there must be some trick involved. They're obviously up to something. And those things are difficult to work through. They're very difficult to work through. So I don't think a Democratic president, President Biden, in January 2021, things are not going to change. Things are not going to change quickly. You can, I think, change the atmospherics. You can certainly change language. You can tone down the language. You can reestablish some channels of communication. You can cut off relationships with this bizarre cult group that we talked about. You could do these things. Yeah. You can do these things. You get control of words. You get control of language, which in diplomacy is very important. But getting back onto a productive track, which we had just started to get on in the second Obama administration, that's going to take time. That's going to be difficult, and it's going to take a lot of patience and a lot of forbearance and a lot of diplomatic skill, and perhaps more diplomatic skill than either side has shown up until now.
Well, like everything, building takes time, but you can destroy or tear it apart within a very short amount of time. So thank you so much for this conversation. I would like to now move to the Q&A. I want to remind everyone that there's a Q&A section in the bottom of your Zoom window, not the chat section, but the Q&A. If you write your questions there, I'm taking a look at it. So far, we have 28 questions. Hopefully, we'll have time for everything. Maybe I'll ask you 2 questions at a time to make it a little bit quicker.
Good idea. And I can take some notes too if you do that. That's a good idea.
All right. We have a short question from Qadir Nabizadeh asking which administrations represented best U.S.-Iran relations after 1979, in your opinion? And also we have a question from Jed asking, has the pandemic weakened the Iranian military or political establishment to the point that they've had to rethink their regional strategy?
Okay, the first one, which administration handled it best? Nobody wanted to deal with Iran. They saw what Iran had done to Jimmy Carter, destroyed his presidency, almost destroyed Ronald Reagan's presidency. And so nobody wanted to deal with Iran. And because they'd seen what had happened, but they had to. You just couldn't ignore. It. George W. Bush, the first Bush, talked about goodwill begetting goodwill, and in his inaugural address in 1989. But when it came down to it, basically he had to tell He had to tell the Iranians, sorry, I have an election coming up. Didn't really mean it. Again, I don't want to say the Obama administration did this better than anybody else, but it saw a way of doing it differently. It saw the need for doing things differently, which is basically you talk to it's an unremarkable thing that you talk to your enemies, you talk to people you don't like, you don't like. And I will give the Obama administration credit that it didn't give up. It ran into real difficulties early on, but it didn't give up. It kept after it. It kept after it. But of course, that, as we saw, that effort, that effort collapsed, or that effort went nowhere, because you had a change of administration that rejected not so much the policy of the previous administration, but the person of the previous president. The pandemic, what a tragedy that is for everybody. I mean, 90,000 Americans dead, 300. How many in Iran? I didn't see the figures for Iran, but almost 400,000 worldwide now. In an ideal world, we would all be working together to fight this, because Iran has some really impressive medical facilities and infrastructure and people, and there are also Iranians working abroad in the medical field. Very sophisticated, and that's, in an ideal world, we would be harnessing that, and we would put aside this need to beat our chest, and this need to appear tough, and this fear of looking weak. And instead, we would find a more reasonable approach and said, look, this is something that affects all of us. We can work together. We can work together on it. Unfortunately, we haven't reached that ideal world yet, and we're still stuck in past patterns of futility.
We have a question from Phil Hardy. It's long, I'll try to summarize it, but he's basically talking about putting yourself in the shoes of both sides to understand their perspective, and mentions how we're considering the last 4 decades, but the CIA overthrew the elected Iranian leader, Prime Minister Mossadegh, in early 1950s, 1953, who was nationalizing oil and all of that, and then the CIA reinstalled the Shah of Iran, who was there until late 70s, and the revolution. And he's asking you if you think that basically this interfering in the affairs of other nations and all of that, if the US can understand the Iranian distrust because of the Mossadegh coup in the 1950s, will this basically help diplomacy in reaching an agreement?
Do you want to do one? Do you want to do just this one question, or do you want to do?
Sure. Let me actually pose another one to you. There's another question from Vahraz Honari, who is asking you what you think Biden's move would be, Joe Biden, in the case of winning the presidential election. I think you partially answered this, but basically he's asking if he will go back fully to the JCPOA or set some new conditions.
Okay, let me answer the second one quickly. Again, I think he would immediately would set up some kind of contact, whatever channel would work. It might be through the Swiss, it might be through the Omanis, it might be through the United Nations, it might be foreign minister to foreign minister, as we had before, but to resurrect some kind of communication. Plus, I think he might do as Obama did, to send some signals. And for example, his first Nowruz message, Persian New Year's message, which comes just 2 months after, would come 2 months after his inauguration, just as Obama did, sent a very clear signal. in that message that he wanted to do something that he wanted to do something new. In terms of renegotiating or looking at the JCPOA, the JCPOA to me was important not for the details of its provision, but what it represented. And it represented a new way of doing things. It represented a way that both sides could achieve something without in a different way, through diplomacy, without shouting, without chest beating, without threatening, and whether the details are the same, whether it's a different agreement. I mean, any agreement is open to renegotiate, to review and renegotiation. Maybe there's something that both sides would like to change, but it's in this case it's a matter of tone, and it'll be important that he changes the tone. How the Iranian side responds to that is difficult to predict. I don't think it's going to be anything like a love fest in the near future. In the near future. The question about the 1953, I didn't quite get the meaning of that question, except the idea that yes, I mean this is something that happened. It was obvious a mistake, but I can tell you one story of how this obsession, remained a matter, in people's minds. I think it was about a month into my captivity in Tehran. Someone came and questioned me. One of the captors questioned me, and the first question he asked me was, "What was your role in the nefarious coup d'état of 1953?" And I looked at him and I said, "Well, I had a very minor role," I said, "because I was 10 years old at the time. So my role was very small," but he didn't have much of a sense of humor about that. It's a convenient. I mean, to be honest, it's a convenient. We have convenient clubs to beat each other. We all have grievances. We have grievances against the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic has grievances against us. But at some point, you have to ask the question: what's the purpose of just sitting down and trading grievances and trading grievances? You have a wonderful phrase in Persian. You say "gele gozari." What's the purpose of that? What does it accomplish? It makes you feel good. Maybe it makes you feel, oh, I told him. Yes. I told them. I denounced them. But at the end of the day, if you have a goal, this gets back to an earlier question, if you have a goal, if you have something you want to accomplish beyond just feeling good, then just reciting lists of grievances from 10, 20, 30, 40, 70 years ago, 60 years ago, doesn't accomplish that.
And there's a long, as you said, long list of grievances on both sides. And from a media perspective, I think each side tries to only speak of or recognize their own grievances and not the other side. And that's what people see in their own media and all of that. I have a few questions regarding Israel. One from Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. She's asking, are U.S.-Iran diplomatic relations possible as long as the Iranian government is espousing such a hostile policy towards Israel? And then we have a question from Abdulnabi Alekri asking, what is the role of Israel in fueling the feud between U.S. and Iran? And finally, one from Mohsen Tawakkol saying, I believe if Trump administration tones down its support of Israel, Iran may soften a bit and move closer to an open dialogue with the U.S. And do you think that's possible, that the Trump administration may consider to balance the unconditional support of Israel in order to open dialogue with Iran?
Oh, these are all good questions, including one from my good friend Barbara Slavin, who always can depended upon to ask a tough question. A tough question. No, I mean it was interesting that The story goes that when Ahmadinejad left office in 2013, that Prime Minister Netanyahu went into mourning because he had lost the best. He lost the best tool that he had, his agent, his best agent for creating fear in Israel, and it's reasonable. I mean, when someone threatens to wipe you off the map or erase you from the pages of time or whatever phraseology they use, what kind of reaction do you expect? This is going to create, and particularly given the history, this is what's going to happen. The interesting thing to me, but this was what an Israeli told. This is what an Israeli friend told me. He said that in the Obama time, this hostility toward Iran, had nothing to do with Iran. It was a move by the Israeli right, the far right wing in Israel, in combination with the far right in the United States against Obama. It was something that Obama represented. It had nothing to do with Iran. That Obama, they said, okay, we attack Iran, we attack Obama through Iran. But their real target was Obama, and not Iran. It was a domestic political move of the far right in the two countries. Again, I think that this kind of hostility let me put it this way: when the JCPOA was signed, you had this odd spectacle of the Israeli Prime Minister coming to Washington uninvited by the administration, invited by the Republicans in Congress. I mean, it's an obvious political as an obvious political ploy, getting itself in the middle of a U.S. foreign policy debate. Is this about Iranian hostility toward Israel, which is real, and the Israelis, I certainly don't blame them for taking that very seriously, or is it about something else? Is it about U.S. domestic politics, Israeli domestic politics, and the relationship between the two?
Speaking of countries in the region, I'm going to combine a few different questions about countries in the Persian Gulf. One person is asking you what the role is of U.S. allies in the Persian Gulf. Someone else is asking if you think Saudi Arabia, or in fact Mohammed bin Salman, can push President Trump into a war with Iran if he does get reelected, or do you think that Saudi influence on the Trump administration is decreasing? And we also have another question asking what you think all these sanctions against Iran are trying to achieve, because we've seen in other countries that it hasn't much, and what is Mr. Trump trying to achieve with all these sanctions, which I think you partially answered, but let's look at this group of questions together.
To answer the question, what is he trying to achieve? I don't know. That's the problem. We don't know what the goal is. I sometimes suspect the goal is to feel good, or to look, I suppose, to look tough. I don't know why tough is important. I mean, the Huns were tough, and nobody remembers them for much except ruin and murder. Ruin and murder. I think toughness is sometimes overrated in politics. So I don't know what the point is. As far as the Saudis, it was interesting. At the time of the nuclear agreement, the Saudis and some of their friends were convinced that we and the Iranians had already made up. We were already friends, and the whole thing was done and dusted. The whole arrangement was done and dusted between between our two sides. A Kuwaiti friend put it to me this way. He said, "We see you and the Iranians as a married couple. You had a really difficult marriage. You had a really difficult divorce, but somehow you can't get over each other. And our fear in the Gulf is that somehow you're going to get back together again. You're going to get back together again." Again, if anyone, I mean, everybody. If there's a war, if there's a between the U.S. and Iran, everybody loses. Everybody. But the Arab countries in the Gulf are not going to do well out of it. And they know that. They know where their interests lie. They know where their interests lie. I mean, after all, Iran is their neighbor. And it's a difficult neighbor. But we've all lived with difficult neighbors. Sometimes you have neighbors who play loud music. Sometimes you have neighbors who don't pick up the trash. But they're still your neighbors. And they're not going away. And I have the impression that the Saudis and others in the Persian Gulf, I think they understand that very well.
You have a question from Barry Rosen, is asking if Iran, another former hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, is Mr. Rosen asking, is Iran showing its military capabilities that is willing to respond to American forces, especially in Iraq and possibly elsewhere in the Gulf?
Well, I'm glad to hear from Barry. He's a great friend from a long time ago, from a long time. No, again, for what I think, I mean, the military threat, the military force of Iran, I think has been way overplayed. To the point that you even got presumably serious, sometimes even serious people talking about a new Persian Empire. Now, there hasn't been a Persian Empire worthy of the name, since 600 AD. I mean, 600 CE. It's 1,500 years there hasn't been a Persian Empire. Iran will take advantage of situations. It will embarrass the Saudis. I think its experience. I think when you look at what it does in Iraq, you have to look at its experience in the Iran-Iraq War, which it fought pretty much alone. You have to look at experience with ISIS. Again, in a reasonable world, the U.S. and the Islamic Republic would find some common ground in Iraq, such as resisting violent extremist groups such as ISIS, or resisting maybe the breakup of Iraq into warring parts. I mean, we've seen that. We've seen what that could do, resisting the reemergence of a new Saddam Hussein in Iraq. All of these things. I mean, these are maybe things that maybe the Iranians want. Maybe these are things that we might want. But in current, the sad reality is, under current conditions, we and the Iranians seem unable to talk about things that should be obviously in the common interest.
Thank you. And we have a few more questions in a row. Hussein is asking if you can explain your assessment on Iran's regional plans for the next 5 years and how that would align with U.S. interests in the region. And Mr. Mansour Farhang is asking, former Iranian ambassador is asking about your novel. He says, I understand you've written a novel. If possible, tell us if it involves your experience in Iran and when it's scheduled to be released.
Well, it's nice. That's nice to hear from Ambassador Farhang, who's a neighbor here in New York, by the way. There's a few subway stops away in Queens. The first was about regional plans.
Iran's regional plans for the next 5 years, if you have access to that plan.
Things don't operate that way. In my view, things don't operate that way. Someone once referred to Iranians as chess players. They think ahead. They play the long game. They're not chess players. They are backgammon players. And if you play backgammon, backgammon is backgammon puts there's a certain degree of chance. A good roll, a bad roll can turn things around completely. You can think one or two moves ahead, but that's about as far as you can do. Puts an emphasis on fast thinking, the ability to improvise, the ability to take advantage of a situation quickly. And that's more to the style of diplomacy, I think, that we see going on. That to say, my God, in 5 years, what's going to happen 5 years, 5 years out, especially when you have an Islamic Republic that I think, frankly, you have a very aged leadership, which feels very threatened, probably knows how unpopular it is, and really is pretty much right now. I think my impression is it's from day to day. If you read Dexter Filkins's recent article in the New Yorker, you'll see that. You get the impression these people are sort of hanging on by their fingernails. I don't think anyone is thinking 5 years out. They're thinking the next roll of the die, the next roll of the dice. I thank Ambassador Farhang for mentioning the novel. No, it's not. It doesn't deal with Iraq. Deal with Iraq, but it's fun. I wrote it with a Foreign Service colleague, Ambassador Mark Grossman. The two of us wrote it together, and it takes place in Tehran and Washington in the 1980s, and then in the present. And I won't give it away, but just say that in the present, there are groups in both capitals that are plotting together to start a war between the two countries.
Interesting. We have a question about your time in Iran. Someone is asking if it was difficult for you to deal with the Iranian government after having suffered the treatment when you were one of their hostages.
Well, again, after leaving, I really didn't have much to do with Iran. I continued in my Foreign Service post and was in places like Algeria, Tunisia, United Arab Emirates, Sudan, others. So I really didn't deal with Iran. The only contact I had with the government was with sometimes the Iranian diplomats in those places, and usually if they saw me, they'd run away as fast as they could, run in the other direction as fast as they could. So no, again, but I've always thought. I mean, this is something I've thought and advocated for 40 years, that we should have a more productive relationship with the Islamic Republic. It's not that we be friends. That's a lot to ask, that we be friends with a lot to ask where that might come. But at least something, a relationship that goes beyond just exchanging threats and exchanging insults, which has, I think your audience is very well aware, and it's from the tone of the questions, that has 40 years of that hasn't accomplished very much. I'm also convinced of one other thing, that at some point in the future, I don't know when it's going to be, I don't know, maybe it may not be alive to see it, but when we the Iranians finally wake up and do have a better relationship, we're going to ask ourselves, why did we spend so much time hating each other, or why did we waste so much time hating each other? Because that accomplished nothing.
Well, on that note, it's 3 o'clock. It's the end of our session. I would like to thank you, Ambassador John Limbert, a retired American diplomat and one of the last Americans to serve in Iran. And I would like to thank the Gulf International Forum and all of their staff for organizing this very important event. And I would like to thank the participants, the audience, for joining us today. And I apologize if there wasn't enough time for all the questions. There are still some questions left. Maybe I'll gather all of them and email them to you. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this session, and the recording of this session will be available in a few days through the Gulf International Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.